Welcome to Carbon Bros. I'm Daniel Penny.
And I'm Amy Westervelt. And we are working very hard on our next couple episodes for you. But in the meantime, had two things we wanted to do today.
So first is we'll be playing an extended conversation that I had with Cara Daggett. She was the person at the end of episode 2 who helped us introduce the concept of petro-masculinity, and a lot of people really responded to that clip, so we have decided to roll out a much longer version. The other thing that we're going to be doing is in episode 3, we're going to be talking about some of the, you might call them false solutions on offer regarding how to fix the climate crisis. And in episode 4, we're going to start to articulate what we're calling the real solutions, but we need your help. So what we'd like you to do is send us an email at nontoxicpodcast1@gmail.com. You can even send us a voice note too, actually. And what we'd like you to do is tell us about a solution.
Either a solution that you've seen or a solution that you would like to see to this sort of like dual problem of the masculinity crisis and the climate crisis. Even if it's small, even if it's like the smallest thing.
Yeah, we just want you to send us a little note, tell us about this idea that you have or this thing that you've witnessed, and we'll see if we can include a few of them in our final episode. And next week, we'll be back to our normal schedule, and we'll be releasing episode 3 of Carbon Bros, and the week after, we'll be releasing episode 4.
So look out for those. And in the meantime, here's Cara Daggett, who not only introduced the term petro-masculinity into our show, but to the world.
Cara Daggett, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I thought maybe we could start with the term that you've coined, petro-masculinity, which seems to have taken on a life of its own. To describe the aggressively fossil fuel-loving identity of a certain kind of far-right dude, you coined this term in 2018 in an academic article. This was during Trump's first term. What exactly did you mean by that term, and what were you seeing or reading at the time that led you to this insight?
With that term, I think it took on a life of its own, which was a total surprise to me because it can be understood in this deep structural and historic way, which is really where I wanted to go with it in the article. And at the same time, it's so visibly present that I think just saying the word, people can understand or think of examples that they see out on the road and in their everyday life. When I wrote about this, like you said, it was during the first Trump administration, and what I wanted to do was understand this connection in far-right movements between misogyny, anti-feminist politics, anti-queer politics, and this support for fossil fuel and climate denial. And they still tend to be talked about separately, as if they are coincidentally inhabiting the same movement. And the work that I was reading that led me to feel that they are not coincidentally happening together was really feminist and ecofeminist work that has, for decades, pointed to the structural connections between the way so-called women's work or reproductive labor is exploited and treated, and the way that often racialized work and colonial work is exploited and treated, and then also the way that the work of nature or the work of non-human animals and creatures and plants is exploited and treated, that these kinds of justifications and narratives are really interconnected. And so on the one hand, it's this deep structural thing that can be very hard to see, but on the other hand, conveniently now, although tragically, it's very easy to see on the surface that these things are coming together.
one of the things that you talk about when speaking of kind of like this idea of datedness, is that petro-masculinity, it's not just reactionary, but it's nostalgic, and that it's looking back at a earlier, maybe mid 20th century vision of American life or modernity. How did fossil fuels and particularly the automobile become intertwined with, we could call it like the leave it to beaver patriarchy?
This is really the work of scholars in a tradition called petro-cultures. So the way that American culture is a culture premised on cheap flowing oil, and automobility is a pillar of petrocultures in the United States and really intersects with gender and race strongly. So in terms of how homes are developed and designed, the birth of the suburbs, which makes you not only dependent on a car, but also literally cements the separation between a private gated home sphere and the public sphere, which is where work happens and where politics happens. And one of these is very feminized, the private sphere, the sphere of the figure of the housewife, and one is more masculinized. But also, of course, in the United States in particular, highways are built through thriving Black communities, and the suburbs were spaces of white flight. And then the car creates, or automobility creates, this association between private mobility and movement and freedom that is still with us. And we talk about culture, but these are also infrastructures, which makes it really hard because it's not only about the way we feel about cars, or that we might change images of cars or movies about cars or stories. It's also that it's very difficult to even imagine how life could be otherwise because everything is cemented around us in particular ways. Even if you would like to move away from car culture, often that's impossible for many Americans.
And what is it about this vision of freedom connected to the automobile that is particularly masculine? Because I don't think on the face of it that a car has to be gendered one way or another. It's just a machine from taking you from point A to point B.
My sense is that this notion of freedom is really important, and underlying it is a desire to escape relations of dependency of all sorts. So to escape the fact of dependency, which is really a fact of life. It's most obvious when you're a kid or when you're an older person, or if you have some sort of illness and you need care. But really, every minute of our life, we're dependent on not just other people, but most obviously on our ecologies. And it's not only the car, it's also a broader notion of the way technology becomes a source of escaping dependency. And that's masculinized because often dependency is feminized. It's not only related to the work that women supposedly do naturally or do better, it's also, to be dependent is to be, by definition, in a feminized position. And so the car, I think, unlike other forms of mobility where dependency is a little more obvious, or interconnection and mutuality. And what's interesting is actually, if you look back at the development of the car in the early 20th century, really in the first decades, there were electric cars competing against gas combustion engines. And it wasn't necessarily clear which kind of motive force was going to be dominant. And in the advertising for these early cars, electric cars started to be advertised increasingly towards women, and especially towards upper class and luxury uses, and made to seem or sort of dismissed as more dependent because they did require this kind of collective and often public infrastructure. And so it's something that, a high class woman would use to run her errands in the city. Whereas the gas combustion engine started to be advertised as this vehicle where you could go out into the frontier and you could sort of escape public infrastructure, even though we all know that obviously there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into providing oil and gas so that you can fill up your car. That there's something about an electrical grid, I think, that at that time and probably still today has this greater sense of being interconnected. And somehow the gas combustion engine allowed for this expansiveness.
I think this is something that comes up in fantasies around the automobile all the time, is this idea not just that the car provides freedom of mobility, but that you can go off-road, you can like drive through unspoilt wilderness and nature, and the car allows you to have a relationship with nature, but it's a relationship of kind of dominance.
Yes, one of conquest, exactly. And that's how, if you look at some of the EV trucks, there's this effort to insist that they are as powerful, as good at this kind of frontier landscape management, or better than gas combustion engines. That will be the mark for people of whether this is an acceptable vehicle, and even sometimes designed consciously to look like military vehicles, not just free riding in the country, but actually to look like violent.
So we're thinking of the Cybertruck here.
Not just the Cybertruck, but the Hummer EV. And I also think, I think there's a way that these really, the way that trucks in the last 10 to 20 years have become massively enormous also corresponds, the SUV too, corresponds to design of military vehicles.
Yeah. And it was certainly a kind of arms race, as where it's like, if you're a driver on the road and other people are kind of dominating you with their oversized vehicles, then either you can choose to be dominated and humiliated, or you can get an even bigger car or truck, turn the tables. And there's also, beyond the sort of psychological side of it, there's the reality of just like those super intense high beams that are now 5 feet off because the truck's so high, and they go straight into your eyes if you're driving a sedan at night. And you feel like it's not even safe for me to drive a normal car. If I get in an accident with one of these trucks, like, I'm going to be a pancake. And you nudged in all of these different ways to engage in this competition, I guess, of size. I want to talk about the connection between what seems like kind of material fact of life that isn't innately political, though it certainly has particular values and ideologies baked into it. But how did that become a specifically like political and, as you argue, authoritarian part of the far right, that this obsession with petro-masculinity? Because you don't have to have an authoritarian country in order to gas, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the sort of resource nationalism of the mid 20th century. There were lots of different variations around gas and political projects, or, fossil fuel and political projects that didn't turn out fascist necessarily. I was hoping you could talk about that.
Here, I think it's good to have a global perspective on the development of oil and gas markets, because prior to the 1970s and the so-called oil crisis, the problem of oil was that there was going to be too much of it. If it was just allowed to flow, once you discovered oil in a particular place, there could be a glut, and that would sink prices and therefore sink profits. So there was a lot of government involvement and regulation at all levels to try to control how oil was going to enter the market. And because we were also dealing with largely global north oil companies, the so-called Seven Sisters, who were operating often in non-Western contexts, the Middle East, South America, also the US has always been a petrostate. And in those contexts, some scholars have argued that the US and other European countries where these oil companies are headquartered were complicit in preferring authoritarian regimes in the petrostates because it's easier to control this resource in that kind of regime. And when some countries might have tried to nationalize their resources through social democratic movements, Iran, Iraq, the US was often on the other side trying to stop the democratization of oil. In some ways, we think now we have authoritarianism and it's this new thing in the United States, but the US and oil has always had an authoritarian a very strong authoritarian dimension in terms of how do you best control oil markets for profit. Then in the 1970s, it's a complicated story, but the first kind of movement or iteration of OPEC was actually a lot of these global south countries taking more control over their own oil resources.
An anti-colonial.
Yeah, it was anti-colonial movement. And they were saying, basically, they just wanted a bigger share of the profits to keep for their own people, their own countries. I mean, in the US, it's always talked about as some kind of shady cartel, but they actually used the strategies that the US had innovated to control its own oil markets in Texas. So I think that global history helps us to see that oil has always needed a kind of strong-arm state. The fascist piece is a bit different. I think the fascist piece that we see today it's the piece of how do you turn populist energies and popular senses of angst towards this authoritarian politics when it's not necessarily in the interest of the public to be governing oil this way. How do you ensure that you're keeping public movements in your favor? And I think here the emotions and the resonance and narratives around gender identity are really important, and not just for men. I think they're important for many women too, especially white women, if you think about this intersection of gender and race.
You're listening to Carbon Bros. I'm Daniel Penny, and I want to take a moment to ask you if you are enjoying what you're hearing, to pause and leave a review of this show. It's how other people find us, and it helps grease the wheels of the algorithm. So please, if you like Carbon Bros, show your support. So you mentioned, it's not necessarily in the public interest to be governing oil or sort of promoting oil policies that we've been promoting, because obviously we're living in the midst of a climate crisis, pumping more oil, and then turning that into CO2 by burning it is not in anyone's best interest. Many oil companies and oil-dependent industries see themselves, under threat and have been working very diligently since the 1980s to shape and alter public opinion and public debate in addition to the particular policies that govern them as a way of forestalling that reckoning. I think the kind of genius part of all of this was to link that sense of loss or the threat of change to masculinity, which since the 1970s or maybe earlier, but certainly since the women's liberation movement or second wave feminism or however you want to frame it in the global north, this has been ebbing and flowing change in our society, and that many men feel that it's an erosion of the way things used to be. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about this idea of how those two threats are linked, a threat to our way of life.
We're living in the midst of what many call a polycrisis, because we have climate crisis, but we also have a crisis of capitalism, which I think is some of the phenomena that you're pointing to are stemming from the related crisis of capitalism. And so when I look, for example, at how oil and gas are sold, what narratives are used to advocate for oil and gas, and also what narratives are used to advocate for energy, so also for wind, for solar, they are picking up these same narratives. The two narratives that I see over and over, one of them is, we've already talked about, is independence. Is this freedom is independence. The other is jobs. And again, this is not necessarily true. It's not true, for example, that the coal industry provides that many jobs anymore. For
just the idea of coal miners.
The idea of coal miners, but also the time when there was that kind of really strong unions that had dignified, well-paid work, and also work that was understood to be a backbone of the country, work that was respected. And I think the loss of jobs like that more generally happens at the same, it is also a loss of this kind of breadwinner identity that's a very gendered role, and is not necessarily the fault of the feminist movement. This is a crisis of how the capitalist economy is organizing labor. And indeed, we can see that as women join the labor force in the last several decades, in some ways, women helped cushion the loss of labor power for households. By adding a second wage, you're helping to cushion the way that wages have not kept up with growth or inflation, for example. But nevertheless, the way it feels is that if your identity to be a hegemonic, masculine, successful man, if part of that is that you have this dignified job where you can make enough money to support your family, you can make enough money to support a housewife, perhaps. If that is just increasingly out of reach, and you have these narratives about it's the fault of feminists, it's the fault of climate activists, it's easy to see how that kind of narrative might work, even though it's not necessarily true. But the only way to make the case that it's not true is to have a strong critique of capitalism, which is something that in this country has not been appealing to the Democratic Party. Even now with this latest victory of Trump, I was thinking right afterwards, well, maybe some of the centrist leadership will say, I guess our strategy doesn't work of pivoting further right. Maybe we should listen to the leftist members of our party. And instead it was the opposite. It was it's always the fault of the left. This is where my anger comes in.
Yeah, I feel you. I want to talk about the fantasy of petro-masculinity and the projection of power that goes with it. I think on the one hand, there's the threat that people are going to come and take things away, that feminists are going to take away your masculinity, that climate protesters or libs are going to take away your diesel truck. But then there's also the kind of pleasure in fantasizing destruction of those enemies, driving through a crowd of climate protesters. Can you talk a little bit about that, the fantasy aspect of petro-masculinity?
This fantasy of petro-masculinity and the violence that goes along with it, in some ways, is an expression of an acknowledgement, albeit on an unconscious level, of the existential crisis that we are actually facing in terms of climate change. And the fantasy element is, I think, the fact that all of us who live in very energy-intensive cultures are every day living on top of violence, living through violence. But there's a lot of work that's done to hide that. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of suppressed and repressed shame and violence that comes with this way of life. For those of us like you, I'm sure, and me and others who study and work on climate, it's heavy. It really, people talk about climate anxiety, climate grief. This fantasy is another psychological position to respond to this, the acknowledgement of this violence in the world. And it is to refuse to feel shame and to say, I embrace this, and this actually is righteous, and I'm going to somehow fold this into a story that supports me in my sense of goodness, and that therefore feels very pleasurable and very good. And so in some ways it's a fantasy, because of course it is denying a whole host of real problems. But on the other hand, I think we need to understand the fantasy and kind of denial that is happening in what you might think of as the centrist liberal space. So sometimes I think that this reactionary politics feels more deeply the crisis of climate than sometimes some liberal politicians do.
So you're thinking here of the kind of like everything will be fine, or we'll need to make, if we just have a few policy tweaks, we'll make a few adjustments, and like that kind of liberal centrist approach.
Yeah, the idea that mostly we can continue everything just the same, and we'll just have a couple technological fixes, and things will just continue on. This is often called the eco-modernist position, that you could just continue growth of material throughput, growth of expansion of energy indefinitely. And for what? It's often not, it's really, we've lost track of what is energy for. It's more the actual process of expansion and producing becomes itself the goal.
And then the induced demand that goes with it.
Yes.
Because as long as there's more available, we might as well use more for generative AI or number of boondoggles.
Exactly.
I want to talk about, you argue that petro-masculinity is a form of climate refusal. That's not just ignoring climate change, but it's actively asserting a retrograde, anti-democratic vision of life in order to prevent society from engaging with climate reality, we might call it. And could you talk a little bit about kind of where the rubber meets the road here? I'm thinking about things like Trump's attempts to prevent New York from keeping its congestion pricing scheme, or trying to roll back California's emission standards.
What we're seeing right now is this multiplication of discourses and strategies of denial, from soft denial, different justifications for denial, and by talking about refusal, or sometimes I call it defiance, there's sometimes, because you can see classic denial happening in the Trump administration all the time too, all the different strategies we're familiar with. But at the same time, sometimes there's just outright, so what? Maybe it is happening. But if it is, the US should be on top of that. And if it is, let's accelerate and get all the money and goods we can out, because what else? I mean, it's
Like get while the getting is good.
it's a winking denial. It's like it doesn't really matter. It really gives the lie to it doesn't actually really matter if we're persuading people on the basis of facts, because underneath we might even all know this is happening, but we decide that we're just not going to respond to the
This is like
problem.
climate nihilism.
Yeah, yeah. But openly defiant. Just I refuse, like refusing to engage in it whatsoever.
I spoke with Richard Seymour about his book, Disaster Nationalism.
Hmm.
And one of his arguments is that ultimately this real world floods, heat waves, supply chain disruptions are going to make the posture of petro-masculinity difficult and maybe impossible to maintain. And that at some point in the coming decades, we'll see a rightward shift towards eco-fascism. You've already touched on this idea of eco-modernism. I think Elon Musk is a bridge. What do you make of that argument? Is petro-masculinity here to stay, or are you already seeing kind of the incipient or nascent stages of some other version of masculinity as energy forms are forced to change?
On the right now, and I'm interested to hear your own reporting on this, but I see really contradictory styles of masculinity. And sometimes they can feed into each other emotionally, but in some ways, materially, like you're pointing out, materially, they can't coexist. And so when we think about nostalgia, we've talked about nostalgia for this mid-20th century moment of American acceleration and car culture and suburbs, but there's also nostalgia for, and this is very common in fascist movements across the last 100 years, a nostalgia for pre-modern, pre-capitalist even
Yeah.
life.
Feudal.
Yeah, this idea that technology has emasculated men. And a lot of the imagery here is like naked muscle torsos holding spears, holding hand weapons. This idea that like the power of men is totally in control of the technology of this weapon. And then I've traced this to looking at advertising in the 20th century, where to manage this idea that technology can emasculate men, a lot of the ads, especially in the middle of the 20th century, had men, their hands or their torsos like looming over technologies, looming over an electric grid, for example, looming over oil derricks, or Union Carbide, which is a petrochemical company, had the giant hand ads where there's like enormous hand coming down to deliver chemicals to farmers in India. And of course, they were responsible for the Bhopal disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's where ecofascism comes in, is this strand that's in fascism that is actually afraid of technology as an emasculating force. And it's probably also what we see in the so-called tech bros, this sense of hypermasculinity coming from a sense that they've maybe in the past been called geeks, or somehow being really reliant on digital technology is not as masculine, as masculinized. So this is an anxiety that crosses over periods, this anxiety about technology. And I think it really, how we'll see it play out probably depends on how technological shifts happen. So I wouldn't want to predict, but I do think as long as there's power and profit to be had from fossil fuels, we will continue to see some form of petro-masculinity. But like I said, in this either contradictory or productive relationship with ecofascism.
One of the things that I think is interesting about the nihilistic or like end of the world apocalyptic side of petro-masculinity. You'll see on Twitter, people will say things like when there's a civilizational collapse, like, what are you going to do with your electric vehicle? How are you going to get out of the zombie apocalypse? You got to have a car. And there are all of these fantasies on the right circulating around the end of the world, breakdown of civilization, where it's just a Darwinian or war of all against all. And you won't be able to rely on the electric grid. And so molecules are going to be what saves you, hydrocarbons. And that you'll need them in your kind of like heroic journey that is an escape from civilization into the wilderness and into like your true masculinity.
Yeah, this brings us right back to dependency, right? And really to these deeply held stories about what is the state of nature, which come, like you say, out of Western political theorists who made it up and has nothing to do with what scientists or archaeologists find about how humans actually did live. And I see this, my kids got interested in this survival show. What's it called? Alone. There's all these survival shows and you watch it and they're just somebody totally alone. And you're like, that's not how humans have ever lived. That's not how humans survive. We survive together in communities. And actually, the best security tactic is interdependency and mutualism. And so this brings us back, even like I said, to the early advertisements of EVs versus combustion engines. There's something about the electrical grid that instantiates in infrastructure interdependency and then is therefore abhorrent to this way of thinking that somehow state of nature living is a bunch of adult men running around having war with each other. If you read Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau, you're like, where are the children in this picture? Where are the older people? Where are the women? Like, where is anyone else in this world? They're evacuated from the scene.
I think in the last part of our conversation, I'm curious about zooming out for a moment. We've really reflected on the scene in the US, and I think for good reason, because the US is, one, the world's largest fossil fuel producer, and two, kind of the bellwether and most influential political, cultural force in the world. But the US isn't the only scene of this conflict. You're in Germany right now. AfD, which is a kind of far crypto-Nazi party, just got second in the national elections, right? There are other places where the far right is ascendant. What's happening around petro-masculinity elsewhere? And are there kind of other variations on this theme, I guess is what I'm getting at. Obviously, there are going to be continuities, but I'm particularly curious about differences, because those show that it's not a kind of predetermined material reality, so culture and politics are going to follow inevitably.
That's really true. And I think there's more research to be done to show the way that masculinity intersects with fossil fuel power in other petrostates in particular. And this will be different depending on each place's history with global empire. So sometimes a nationalist project was a project of decolonial assertion, of gaining independence from a colonial system. But there could still be, and have been, gendered hierarchies involved. I think nationalism itself is something that it's hard to untangle from gender hierarchy, especially given its emergence in the 19th century, when you get these solidification of the modern roles of breadwinner and housewife and so on. At the same time that there are differences, you can see, I think there's also more research to be done on these connections transnationally between these movements. So you have Germany, other places in Europe, like you mentioned, Russia, the Philippines, Milei in Argentina, Bolsonaro in Brazil. These are movements that are very specific to each place, but also that are talking to each other and sharing strategies. And they're not all petrostates, but they all, in different ways, practice a kind of climate denial, or at least a neoliberal politics of acceleration. And I think also where the US could learn the most is in realizing that there are some really exciting resistance movements happening outside of the US, particularly, and this is not my area of expertise, but I'm following it because I think it's really exciting, particularly in South America. A lot of leftist movements at different times taking power, experimenting with ways to either nationalize resources or decarbonize. It's hard to be successful, but I think there are new ideas happening outside of the US too that we should be attentive to.
And I guess in the case of somewhere like Germany, it's not a petrostate anymore. I guess it was a coal-producing nation, but that has largely been eclipsed by wind and solar and other renewables. I don't know what the grid mix looks like in Germany anymore, especially since they got cut off from the Nord Stream.
And they use a lot of gas, which is imported. It's not a petrostate, but it is a petro-culture, especially has a very strong culture of automobility. And this is where this distinction between, is it about fossil fuels or is it about more generally a kind of climate refusal, or more generally about energy expansion in whatever form? That's where that becomes helpful. But the AFD, there are a lot of resonances, especially around immigration policies and fears. And yeah, it's very rooted in East Germany, which is like a lot of that has lost out to West Germany in terms of economic outcomes.
And that's the former coal-producing part of Germany.
Much of it, yeah.
And it makes me wonder a lot about the kind of end of the inevitable energy transition. I guess that's even being optimistic. There may never be a transition. It could just be the energy addition. But if fossil fuel production is to be phased out, and in fact it already is being reduced in terms of the headcount required in the US. I think there have been mass layoffs the past few years in the oil industry in the US just through automation. Like fewer people are needed. And I'm curious about the politics that type of automation or the just shuttering fuel production. Like what happens to those people and what kind of politics does that produce?
We can look at the example of coal and see how it could play out. And this is one of my colleagues and co-authors named Shannon Bell did this research into Friends of Coal, which was a AstroTurf advocacy campaign for the coal industry, that when there were a lot of jobs lost over the years in the coal industry, and there was concern on the part of the industry, exactly like you're saying, that there would be a less public support, especially because some of the ways that coal was using less labor is things like mountaintop removal, where they're just exploding mountains, leading to a lot of environmental damage in communities. Friends of Coal started attaching coal to masculine symbols like NASCAR, hunting, the military, and making it into this, like, instead of being attached to your union, which was usually maybe how your strongest emotional attachment would be as a coal miner, you become attached to coal itself as in this symbolic territory as power. So that's a possibility. I think also the problem with oil that we've been talking about is it's not just on the producer side, it's on the culture and consumer side. People understand that oil is part of their everyday life, and there's a lot of fear in what that means in terms of how ways of life need to change. I think there's a problem of petrochemicals, so even as we might decrease some oil use for motive force. The oil industry is expanding their petrochemical production, and they're using the same tactics to bring these facilities into communities that maybe have lost a lot of industry, and say, these are communities that had maybe strong grassroots environmental movements against former extractive industries, but they say, but we're going to give you jobs. So again, it's this kind of jobs narrative. And even it's really hard to think of how to combat all of these different facets, but even many states have used oil wealth to fund education systems. So in Oklahoma, for example, the politicians will say, we can't get rid of this because our school system relies on oil wealth. And this is what I was talking about, that this really is deeply existential. On the one hand, there are fossil fuel elites who are villains. We should point to them. On a broader sense, public interest should not be in oil. But detangling the ways that oil has entered every facet of our lives is going to take a transformation. It's not as simple as just switching a fuel.
And I think to get to this point of it being entangled in every facet of our lives, the sense that it's felt on the level of gender itself. That
Yes.
like your very existence as a man or a woman is predicated upon access to fossil fuels, and that is the most, for most people, I would say that's the most fundamental aspect of their identity, deeper than race or class or nationality. And if that is threatened, what even are you?
This is what the power of using a gender lens is, that this enters your body. Like, not just your identity, but what you desire, like erotically, what feels good, pleasure.
Got a lot of work to do.
It starts with recognition.
Thank you so much for coming on. This was a really stimulating conversation. You've given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to this series.
And that's it for this bonus episode of Carbon Bros. As always, I'm Daniel Penny, and I host this show along with my good friend Amy Westervelt. As the bros we talk about endlessly on this podcast like to say, smash that like and subscribe button.